All right, so I think we will get started. Welcome, everyone. It's great to see all 100 of you. My name is Benjamin Day. I'm a senior campaigner for Friends of the Earth. Friends of the Earth is a environmental advocacy organization with over 5 million members all across the United States. And it's my pleasure to basically be able to introduce our panel and then to get out of your way. So we have with us today Isha Rangani, who's the Marine Geoengineering Coordinator for the Home Alliance. She's going to give us kind of an intro to a high-level intro to marine geoengineering and marine carbon dioxide removal. Then we have Dr. Lisa Levin, who is Distinguished Professor Emerita at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography at the University of California, San Diego. We're joined by Dr. David Santillo, Senior Research Scientist at Greenpeace Research Laboratories, as well as Dr. Susanna Lidstrom, Researcher in Environmental History at KTH Royal Institute of Technology, and also visiting scholar at the Center for Marine Biodiversity and Conservation at the Scripps Institution. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from you all. Unfortunately, James Carey from Ocean Care and James Cook University couldn't join us today. He had something come up last minute, so his voice will be missed. But I'm looking forward to hearing from the rest of the panel. Isha, do you want to get started?
Yeah.
Great.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I am quickly going to just give you an overview of what marine geoengineering broadly means. And just before that, we can basically divide marine geoengineering into marine carbon dioxide removal and also into marine solar radiation modification. But for today's talk, we're just going to focus on marine carbon dioxide removal. So marine carbon dioxide removal refers to approaches that use the ocean to take carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and store it in the ocean for long periods of time. And these methods aim to enhance natural processes such as phytoplankton growth, seaweed cultivation, or changes in ocean chemistry. And they are being explored as tools to help slow climate change. And right now, most of them are in their experimental stage. So I'm going to begin by talking about ocean fertilization. This is a method in which iron or other nutrients are added to parts of the ocean in order to stimulate plant growth. The idea is by fertilizing the ocean, especially in regions that have lower biological productivity, minute plants called phytoplankton, which grow they grow very readily, will multiply. And as these plankton grow in number, they can absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and sink to the bottom of the ocean. Next, I'm going to talk about artificial upwelling. This method involves pumping nutrient-rich deep water from the deep ocean to the surface, again, to stimulate the growth of phytoplankton and thereby increase the ocean's ability to absorb atmospheric carbon dioxide. And this process aims to mimic natural upwelling events, which naturally bring nutrients from the depths to the surface, thereby boosting primary production and increasing carbon sequestration. Next, we have macroalgae cultivation and sinking. Seaweed or macroalgae absorbs carbon dioxide through photosynthesis, and then they store the carbon within their biomass. So one proposed method for carbon storage is it involves collecting and compressing seaweed biomass and then sinking it to the deep ocean where the carbon can be stored. And this aim basically is to take advantage of the deep sea's capacity to isolate carbon from the atmosphere. And next we have biomass sinking. This is similar to the previous technology that we just talked about, except that here instead of seaweed, they would use terrestrial material, and this material can include grasses, softwoods, hardwoods, and also agricultural byproducts like corn or sugarcane. And then we are going to talk about ocean alkalinity enrichment. This method involves attempting to increase the ocean's alkalinity to enable it to draw down more carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And there are two primary methods suggested for achieving this. One is to adding ground alkaline rocks or alkaline liquids to the ocean or coastlines. And the other is by using electrochemical techniques. And OAE basically aims to make the seawater slightly more alkaline so it can uptake and store more carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So I'll break them down. So when we talk about alkaline rocks or enhanced weathering, fine ground alkaline materials or stuff like limestone or olivine can be added to the oceans or coastlines. And as they dissolve, they act a little bit like adding an acid to water. Thereby, they neutralize the acidity and then let the ocean absorb more carbon. And in order to do this at scale, large amounts of mining would be required to be done on land. And then the second way in which OAE can be done is electrochemical approaches. Seawater can be passed through an electrochemical system, which is powered by electricity. And then this process would create an alkaline stream of water, which can be returned back to the ocean, thereby boosting the uptake of carbon dioxide. And then last method that I'm going to talk about is liquid CO2 injection. This method involves capturing carbon emissions from power plants or industrial facilities, typically by using a sorbent chemical to trap the carbon before it exits as a smokestack. And then the captured carbon is converted into liquefied or carbonate state and then introduced into geological formation or subseabed locations as a mean of long-term storage. It is similar to land-based carbon capture and storage, but it takes place offshore. That's just a quick overview of all of the technologies, and I will stop here and hand it over to Lisa to take it from here. Thank you. Yes, we can see your screen, but Lisa, I think you're muted.
Mute. Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yep, coming through loud and clear.
Okay. Thank you, Isha. And so what I'd like to do to start us off is actually talk about environmental considerations of the different technologies that Isha has described. Usually, we sort of put environmental safety at the end of a long list of issues. It rarely has a chance to be front center, but today it will be. So if we look at a global carbon budget, we find that most of the carbon is actually stored in the ocean. And in fact, most of it is stored in the deep ocean. And so it is not surprising that we're considering the ocean as a repository for carbon dioxide that we would like to remove from the atmosphere. The deeper the carbon is placed, the longer it stays out of circulation. So there's a lot of interest in putting it into the deep sea. Isha has just introduced you to many of the technologies that are out there. Most of these attempt to accelerate natural removal processes, either through stimulating photosynthesis, and that's the biological category. She didn't mention blue carbon because we won't be talking about it today, but enhancing coastal wetlands is definitely one strategy. Then we have macroalgal harvesting and the stimulation of phytoplankton growth, as she talked about, and biomass sinking. And then we have abiotic approaches that involve increasing alkalinity through the addition of minerals or electrochemical methods, as she just said. Isha didn't directly mention direct ocean removal, but there is a technology to strip CO2 out of seawater, and then it would be placed into a geological subsurface features. And all of these technologies tend to depict the disposal into an ocean that's devoid of life. But in fact, we know that that's not the case. The ocean is filled with life throughout the water column and the seafloor, as depicted by this figure from a recent paper by Natalia Gallo that considers MCDR in the deep ocean. I want to start by talking about iron fertilization. This exploits typically iron as a limiting nutrient and targets high nutrient and low chlorophyll areas of the ocean, especially high latitudes. There are many natural analogs for iron fertilization, volcanic eruptions, wildfire ash, and phytodetritus falls, and that's what you see here is a naturally occurring phytodetritus fall at 2,000 meters off the Aleutian Islands. This was from a cruise we had in May of last year. And what we saw is accumulation of goo covering and basically starting to smother the seafloor. Iron fertilization would continue for decades, potentially continuously. So this 1 week, we don't know how long this event lasted, but it lasted at least a week while we were there at Santa Seep. So it just helps visualize what iron fertilization might look like as phytoplankton is growth is stimulated, aggregates, and sinks to the deep sea floor. The study of upwelling areas tells us that by stimulating algal blooms as intended with iron fertilization and artificial upwelling, that these blooms can generate low oxygen zones and high CO2 zones, essentially ocean acidification beneath them. It can release dissolved organics as well as potentially nitrous oxide and methane, which are potent greenhouse gases. And all of these changes lead to animal avoidance, habitat compression vertically for pelagic animals, biodiversity loss, the potential for altered vertical migrations in the mesopelagic, and then ultimately potentially even less effective carbon sequestration. Now, there have been 19 different experiments to test iron fertilization. Most of them haven't been of long enough duration to actually document what kinds of impacts are occurring in the water column or how the animals are responding. A recent modeling of large-scale marine carbon dioxide applications, the type we need to actually affect climate, suggests that the biological MCDR approaches will lead to net oxygen loss in the ocean. And that this work by Ashleys et al. Points out that both iron fertilization and macroalgal sinking and with complete remineralization will lead to the greatest oxygen losses. And I should point out that OAE and the abiotic technologies will not draw down oxygen the same way. Let's see, I'm having trouble going in the right direction here. The biological approaches raise a series of environmental issues that need to be addressed. They potentially will change phytoplankton composition. Iron fertilization will favor diatoms. Macroalgal growth could remove nutrients and favor dinoflagellates. Fertilization has been shown, at least in one case, to induce toxic algal blooms and domoic acid production. There are changes in light penetration that affect the plankton and their vertical migrations and food webs. And then the introduction of crop and wood waste to the deep ocean runs the risk of introducing terrestrial toxins and pesticides and herbicides. So, for example, Carboniferous has applied for an EPA application to dispose of sugarcane waste into the Orca Basin in the Gulf of Mexico. And, we don't know, but sugarcane on land is treated with a series of herbicides that might actually then end up in the Gulf of Mexico. Many of the technologies would smother the seafloor either with algae or phytodetritus accumulations, and this could lead to loss of benthos. There are concerns about nutrient robbing, macroalgal growth, very extensive growth can remove nutrients that would otherwise go to phytoplankton, altering the food webs. And there's also robbing of one place to affect another. We know that the ocean is highly connected through the movement of water, particles, and animals. So what we do in one place affects others. A recent model by Tagliabue looking at massive iron fertilization in the Southern Ocean suggests that it would amplify biomass losses due to climate change, especially in in the tropics for all the exclusive economic zones you see here in red. In other words, it robs nutrients that would have normally made their way from the Southern Ocean through the tropics would be used up in the Southern Ocean by iron fertilization. If we look at the abiotic approaches, these were already introduced, and so I won't spend any time talking about them, but I do want to talk about the potential impacts. At this point, they are very uncertain. There haven't really been any at-scale tests of these, but we know that the goal is to introduce alkalinity that elevates pH. So this means, at least in a very localized way, pH would be raised. This can lead to somewhat differential phytoplankton responses, with calcifiers benefiting and leading potentially to smaller plankton, again with food web consequences. But many of the papers that are coming out now are very small scale studies or mesocosm studies and show very minimal impacts. But what we don't know are the geochemical, physiological, and behavioral changes that animals in the ocean will have, especially at very large scales. There are some co-benefits to ocean alkalinity enhancement. The amelioration of ocean acidification is one of these. It could enhance shellfish growth of oysters and mussels, for example, but it should be pointed out that that growth involves more calcification, and calcification releases CO2. So it would somewhat counter the alkalinity effect and reduce the additionality of that. There are concerns that the ocean alkalinity enhancement through particles could lead to plankton consuming the powdered minerals as if they're food. There are concerns about reprecipitation and the potential smothering on the seafloor. And then some of the technologies, the electrochemical technologies and direct ocean carbon capture involve massive intake of water, and that intake leads to loss of plankton, fish, and invertebrate larvae. And that's one of the reasons that many of the trials are now co-locating with desal plants or power plants, which are already intaking that seawater. But this would have to expand greatly to apply these technologies at scale. The particulate OAE methods involve some toxic metal release. Olivine has nickel and chromium and some cobalt. There's silica dust and some of also concerns about calcium, magnesium, and iron. The toxic metals tend to bioaccumulate in the food web, and there have yet to be any really serious long-term studies about whether those metals, when olivine, for example, is applied, would enter the food web or even the food supply of humans. There's concern about turbidity, production of a white ocean from the mineral introductions, and there are consequences of light change for primary producers and food webs. Overall, we're still in very early stages of studying. I would say the scientists are in early stages of studying OAE consequences. We don't really know how different systems, coral reefs or kelp forests, for example, might, or mangroves, might experience severely increased alkalinity, and the consequences for fisheries remain unknown. OAE methodologies involve major life cycle considerations. As Isha mentioned, there's massive terrestrial mining involved for some of them. There's very high electricity demand for others. There can be an intensification of shipping and train transport. There can be high costs, and there are challenges with disposing of some of the byproducts. And as mentioned, one of those byproducts is the removal of CO2, which by direct ocean carbon capture, for example, which would be stored subsurface. And there is some concern about seismic hazards of injecting CO2 into basalt, and as well as potential leakage causing acidification. But again, there's very early days of studying this. Many of the MCDR approaches involve increased ship traffic, which produces noise and vibration, and those have wavelength frequencies, I should say, that overlap pretty well directly with animal sound production and animal hearing ranges. So that is a consideration. And then as our speaker, James Carey, wasn't able to join us, and he was going to talk about monitoring, reporting, and verification. I'll mention this briefly. This is basically documenting the removal of carbon, the effectiveness of the technologies, and there are many opportunities and challenges with this. I want to point out that OAE and the direct ocean carbon capture have a lot of complexity. There are multiple mineral types, and each can be ground into different particle sizes, and each have different dissolution dynamics. And often the CO2 after application is not removed from the atmosphere at the point or time of implementation, but there's delays or change, in time and space. Mixing and dilution of the alkalinity signal is highly dependent on location, tidal phase, and climate cycles. The coastal sediment type receiving application, for example, of minerals, will definitely affect the outcome of enhanced rock weathering, which is what the spreading of olivine is, or liming. Tracking reprecipitation of the minerals is very difficult. And the biological responses that happen may also factor into additionality of CDR. So there's a lot of complexity. So we aren't really at readiness and ability to actually assess how much carbon has been taken up. The phytoplankton and macroalgal stimulation approaches also pose some MRV challenges. The fate of sinking organic matter is really poorly known. I mean, one example is running tides disposal of wood pucks coated with alkaline material and I think seeded with algae. They put out tens of thousands of tons of this off Iceland, and then nobody knew where those actually went or ended up. We need improved understanding of carbon cycle processes, and we need to definitely assess additionality under the phenomena of nutrient robbing and the unintended biological effects. Monitoring for the fates of phytoplankton and macroalgae, especially in the deep ocean, can be extremely costly as well. I think overall, we have very heavy reliance on models to assess carbon removal for all the technologies. And right now, there are questions about the models. The natural internal variability and air-sea flux very often exceeds the MCDR signal in many targeted areas. So it makes it somewhat hard to know how effective these technologies will be. We need a lot of research to guarantee that MCDR applied at scale, that is, at a scale sufficient to affect climate, does not counter the SDG 14 targets and tip multiple planetary boundaries prior to the emergence of climate benefits. And all of these different environmental considerations that I've mentioned, many of them would act to counter the SDG 14 targets that you can see here, as well as tip some of the planetary boundaries related to biogeochemical flows and acidification and biosphere integrity. And then to close, I want to say we do have opportunities. I think we need a larger scale investigation of environmental responses and feedbacks to work alongside monitoring, reporting, and verification. It's not the same thing. I think we need to keep these independent. We should be engaging the deep ocean observing community and understanding eco responses, and also in verifying the many models that are used for MRV right now. And we might consider developing an independent seal of approval as a certification for environmental safety for specific technologies, much as we have done for fisheries, for example. And with that, I want to close and thank you for listening.
Great. And while David is setting up his slides, I forgot to mention at the beginning that we'll have plenty of time for Q&A at the end after everyone's finished speaking. So feel free to use the Q&A box to enter questions as we kind of go along, and we'll address those at the end.
Thank you, Ben. You're all able to see my slides, I hope? And able to hear me? Great. Thank you.
Yes, coming through.
Thanks very much for the invitation to speak, and welcome everyone. Yeah, appreciation to Isha and to Lisa for that introduction. What I'm going to focus on for the next 15 minutes or so is what's been done already to try to develop governance for marine geoengineering activities. And once again, I will touch on the range of techniques, but the focus will be very much on marine carbon dioxide removal. Some of you may be familiar with this high-level review that was prepared by the United Nations group of experts, published in, I think, 2019, which goes through a lot of the background to the methods which Isha touched on, and also a lot of the risks and uncertainties which Lisa has touched on in her presentation. So it's definitely still very much a valid publication if you want to have a look at that background. So starting with such a range of techniques, how would you go about designing a governance regime? Clearly, it's complex. Marine geoengineering is not just one or even a limited range of techniques. It is very diverse in terms of what's being proposed and trialed. One of the obvious places to start was with a marine convention that has a long history in protecting the marine environment from the introduction of wastes or other matter. And that is the London Convention and its more up-to-date London Protocol. The two instruments are running still in parallel, with more than 100 contracting parties across both instruments. And normally these bodies try to work by consensus. Legal changes are different. So legal changes to the protocol will only affect protocol parties. But to a large extent, the work that's been done on marine geoengineering has been done across both of those bodies, so therefore including more than 100 contracting parties around the world. It wasn't designed initially as a regime for the governance of marine geoengineering, but it does fall very much within its remit when people want to put material into the oceans, especially at scale, and the potential for the risks that presents. So the LCLP, as we call it, has a definition of marine geoengineering, which is quite broad. It's a deliberate intervention in the marine environment to manipulate natural processes, including, I would say, primarily to counteract anthropogenic climate change in terms of its intent, and that have the potential to result in deleterious effects, especially where those could be widespread, long-lasting, or severe. And that essentially, although it's a long phrase, it's saying that have the potential to cause pollution. That's the concern that is there within the parties and the structure. So what's already been mentioned, I think by both Isha and Lisa, is the concept of carbon storage in subseabed geological reservoirs. I'm not going to touch on that. The London Protocol has a resolution on that and has regulations in place to control subseabed disposal of carbon dioxide, whatever its origin. That is still being subject to testing that approach and to monitoring the way in which it's being implemented, mainly for land-based sources of CO2. I think time will tell how that goes forwards, but I see that as being somewhat separate from the concept of marine carbon dioxide removal, where we're using the ocean itself as a way of taking in more carbon dioxide. So manipulating those natural processes is a little different. There were plans initially to inject carbon dioxide directly into the seawater or onto the seabed or into shallow sediments. You can still find papers out there where people are proposing this, but that has very largely been discredited, and in some parts of the world is explicitly prohibited. Under the London Convention and Protocol, it is implicitly prohibited because it's only disposal into subseabed geological storage for CO2, which is something that is permissible. And then we have the work that was initiated under the LCLP approach now about, well, approaching 20 years ago, not quite, 18 years ago, in the light of increased interest and especially commercial interest in iron fertilization. So work began in 2007, recognizing the concerns for that activity if it was scaled up, and also looking at the existing knowledge on the environmental impacts and the predictability of ocean fertilization outcomes that existed at that time. The parties to the London Convention and London Protocol, by consensus, agreed a statement of concern in 2007 that was endorsed later that year at a party level. And that led in 2008 to the first resolution in placing restrictions on iron fertilization. And that was extended to ocean fertilization in general, so not just iron. And it set the concept of legitimate scientific research and said that that's as far as things should go. We need to define what that is, but we don't want to see anything beyond legitimate scientific research. That was then developed further with an assessment framework 2 years later in 2010, quite rapid work for a UN body. And that set the definition of legitimate scientific research as those activities that could be assessed and pass all of the different stages of that impact assessment. And then further on from that, in 2013, there was a resolution to amend the London Protocol only from a legal perspective. Now, the resolutions of 2008 and 2010 that introduced the policy approach remain in force, and they apply to both London Convention and London Protocol parties. The amendment, which is yet to enter into force, would provide legal certainty on those changes for parties to the London Protocol. Of course, what that leaves is a number of other techniques which are now under scrutiny because of the ongoing concerns, many of which Lisa has outlined in her presentation. And the reason for those concerns, of course, is that there are many entities out there, research groups, companies. This is just a small selection to give a sense of the different types of techniques which Lisa and Isha have already touched upon. But it's the prominence of the work, the fact that some of it is pressing ahead, almost in the absence of an effective governance regime, that is instilling that extra urgency amongst parties to come up with a way of regulating these activities that can work. And the validity of this and the importance of it is global in nature, because if these methods were ever scaled up to impact on climate globally, then they would essentially have to be deployed at a fairly global scale with different approaches relevant in different areas. But certainly this is not something that is going to be limited to a small number of regions if it is ever deployed. So that's the nature of the basis for the concerns. This just gives a summary of all those steps that I've gone through already. And gives links. So I think these slides will probably be made available, and you can click through to find the different documents that I've already mentioned. And more recently, in October 2022, so coming up to 3 years ago, the governing bodies, so the meeting of parties of the London Convention and London Protocol, made a commitment to prioritize the evaluation of 4 additional techniques alongside ocean fertilization. So those were ocean alkalinity enhancement and electrochemical CDR. They were biomass cultivation for carbon removal. They were marine cloud brightening and also surface albedo enhancement. So 2 marine CDR, 2 marine related solar radiation management proposals. So that commitment was to the scientific groups of the London Convention, London Protocol, to evaluate those techniques. And then the following year in March, the scientific groups confirmed that all 4 of those techniques have at least the potential to cause pollution, if depending on how they're done and where they're done and at what scale. And what that then led to 2 years ago was an agreement by the governing bodies, the meeting of parties of the London Convention and Protocol, endorsing those scientific concerns and saying that on that basis of those concerns, marine geoengineering activities other than legitimate scientific research should be deferred. And again, legitimate scientific research is not just some kind of theoretical concept. It's actually a very specific set of conditions and criteria that need to be met in order to ensure that the research is justified, that it's not going to cause significant adverse effects, and that it is going to be legitimized in the way in which it's approached and not biased through commercial interests. The work is progressing. So last year, the governing bodies agreed to ensure that any ocean-based measures to mitigate climate change prioritize protection of the marine environment. And that's not just because it's important to protect the marine environment for the marine environment's sake, but also because of the fundamental role that the marine environment plays within the climate cycle. So you can't separate out the ocean environment or its biodiversity from the climate itself. So it's not a case of ranking one risk against another. It's about seeing this as a holistic issue that needs a precautionary approach in order to address that. If you want to read more about the approach on legitimate scientific research, there are a number of papers out there. This is just one that I contributed to last year, which unpacks this concept of legitimate scientific research. And I think copies of that can be made available to all participants as well. And just to explain that in approaching this governance, what the parties to the LCLP are not trying to do is just develop governance for the sake of it. It's not there in order to be a barrier to legitimate research. It's not there to dismiss the concept that we need to recognize that there will be scientific research ongoing, as there has been in the past. It's about putting some level of control on that research to make sure that, firstly, we don't go beyond that at this stage. That's the will of the parties, is that we should be looking at legitimate scientific research only at this stage because of the current state of knowledge. And their approach is also to ensure that any such research that does go forward does not cause pollution or other harmful effects on marine biodiversity or the climate, that it will yield information that is valid and relevant in order to support policy making and decision making, and is not biased by commercial interests from the outset, such as through the sale of carbon credits that are simply hypothetical in their nature. So pre-sale of credits for funding of activities is something that is of particular concern, not because of the involvement of private interests in research, but because the potential for that funding to bias the outcomes in order to justify the investment that's being made. That's the concern. So it's not just the LCLP that is significant here. Of course, the Convention on Biological Diversity has also made pronouncements on both ocean fertilization initially in 2008, making many of the same points about the need to assess risks, the need for a global, transparent and effective control and regulatory mechanism, the need for clear justification to gather specific scientific data, the need for prior assessment, and the avoidance of generating or selling carbon offsets as part of that research activity. The CBD again repeated some of these concerns in later years. In 2010, it expanded to all climate-related geoengineering activities, so not just ocean fertilization activities, but recognizing that many of these others may also affect biodiversity. And then most recently in November last year, reaffirms all of its decisions and urges parties and encourages other governments to ensure their proper implementation. So this is very much a current discussion also within the Convention on Biological Diversity, but they make many references to the LCLP as being the current location for a lot of those governance developments. That's also reflected upon in some of the inputs to the this year's Oceans Conference, the UN Oceans Conference. So the point was also made about the Convention on the Prevention of Marine Pollution by Dumping of Waste. This is the London Convention and Protocol, and noting that they only provide at this stage for legitimate scientific research. And then just finally to note that the group of experts that I mentioned at the beginning, GISAMP, they also presented a paper at the UNOC meeting, and that sets out the current state of knowledge for marine carbon dioxide removal. And again, this is a very valid and valuable resource for information. And they also made the point that there are risks and there are trade-offs, that monitoring, reporting and verification remains a very key challenge, something which is still very far from being resolved, and that there is a need for robust regulatory frameworks as an approach going forward. And that is exactly what the parties to the LCLP are trying to do. So I'll stop there and hand back to you, Ben. Thank you very much.
And I will hand directly to Susanna.
There, can everyone hear me and see my screen okay?
Yep, looks good.
Okay. So thank you, Isha and Ben, and thank you, Lisa and David. I will continue the discussion by talking a little bit about the narratives that surround many MCDR proposals in the present, and mention a few potentially misleading messages that these narratives may convey. So most narratives around MCDR follow a similar, pretty predictable structure. They usually begin by stating the urgency of the climate crisis and the lack of progress towards the goals of the Paris Agreement. MCDR is then proposed as one part of the toolkit to be pursued together with carbon emission reductions. The ocean's natural role in the carbon cycle is then often mentioned, as well, and so are co-benefits such as ocean acidification. So this fairly simple narrative can be misleading in the sense that it leaves out important questions and dimensions that should be considered. And these include claims of necessity, consideration of risk, perceptions of the deep ocean, as well as concerns around equity. And I will go through these four in turn to unpack them a little bit. So claims of the necessity of MCDR rely exclusively on the Paris Agreement in the narrowly framed vision of the Paris climate goals as more urgent and more important than all other environmental and social goals. This idea of climate change mitigation as an overarching political goal needs to be reached at all costs and with an increasingly urgent time frame has been described as climate reductionism or climatism by human geographer Mike Hume. He defines it as the reduction of broad social, economic, and environmental policies to narrowly framed, often numerical climate goals. An exclusive focus on keeping the increase in global temperature to below 1.5 or 2 degrees creates a dangerous discourse of urgency that suggests that there isn't enough time to reflect or deliberate, and this may lead to poor decision-making. Most proposals for MCDR use this kind of rhetoric to motivate extreme measures such as geoengineering and to disregard safeguards such as the precautionary principle. So a climate reductionist narrative is a too narrow framework for properly considering all aspects of MCDR, as Lisa's and David's presentations have suggested. So MCDR instead needs to be considered alongside and as integrated with other high-level goals. For the ocean, this includes the goals identified in the Agreement on the Conservation and Sustainable Use of Marine Biodiversity of Areas Beyond National Jurisdiction, known as the BBNJ Agreement. For biodiversity, it includes the goals of the Global Framework for Biodiversity. In an even broader sense, it includes Agenda 2030 with the Sustainable Development Goals. So framed by this broader picture, the necessity of MCDR appears more questionable. And another point to make here is that the viability of MCDR technologies are so far unproven, and so this also undermines these claims of necessity. So the second dimension I want to discuss is risk considerations. So most MCDR narratives lack recognition of relevant risks, including potential unintended impacts on marine ecosystems, such as Lisa described, including loss of marine biodiversity, unintended impacts on the climate, and also impacts on communities, such as impacts on fisheries or other coastal economies. So claims that MCDR is simply safe and effective, as we may see in some instances, are just not true. Consideration of risk is especially important in relation to scale. So whereas risks may be small on the scale of trials and experiments, if we consider deployment at a climate relevant scale, the increase in risk becomes correspondingly bigger. And so this distinction of risk at different scales is often not made in proposals for specific MCDR technologies. So many narratives of MCDR also include references to the ocean's natural carbon cycling processes. You may see terms such as the cleaning up or mopping up or scrubbing of carbon from the atmosphere, suggesting that MCDR may work as a type of waste management technology. But as Lisa described, and Isha as well, a lot of these technologies instead include adding a lot of materials to the ocean and thus increasing waste at least as much as they may clean up. So this idea that it would basically be a cleaning apparatus is also can also be misleading. So in this context of the risk narrative, there are some lessons to be learned if we look at the narrative surrounding deep seabed mining, where we see that in the beginning of that discussion in the 1960s and 70s, there was almost no recognition of risk. Much less was known about deep ocean ecosystems. And we can see then that over decades, both environmental and social risks have moved into the center of those discussions. So a similar development of risk recognition in MCDR narratives could inform more holistic considerations of the risks involved in MCDR. So I then want to talk about perceptions of the deep ocean. Lisa touched a little bit about this. So most illustrations of MCDR technologies look like the top picture here, and both Lisa and David showed, and Isha too, showed some similar illustrations. So basically the deep ocean is portrayed as a flat line without any features and without any life or diversity or variability. And we know that this is not true, and that the deep ocean instead looks like the bottom picture, which Lisa also showed, where it is much more clear that any MCDR interventions would exist alongside and interfere with many different deep sea ecosystems. And we also know that these play a central role already in the carbon cycle and other Earth systems, and also have many other confirmed and potential values for people. So the treatment of the deep ocean as this empty space really relies on very outdated scientific knowledge, and continues a trajectory of seeing the ocean as a place where waste can be placed out of sight and out of mind, continuing a history of dumping unwanted materials in the deep ocean. We know that we have placed atomic waste in the deep ocean in the past, and many other hazardous materials. So my final point is that also questions of equity are not central in MCDR proposals. So basically these questions can be considered in 3 different categories: who gets to decide, who is impacted, and who benefits. So who gets to decide includes both who is involved in research. Most research and innovation for MCDR in the present is concentrated in North America and Europe, with little involvement from researchers or engineers in other parts of the world. So regarding who is impacted, includes how negative impacts or unintended consequences could be planned for or foreseen. And if they occur, who is held responsible? And these impacts include local effects and regional, directly in relation to the proposed technologies, but also any unforeseen effects that may happen on the global scale through interference with deployment at scale. And who benefits? How should any financial benefits be distributed, for example? We know that benefits from deep seabed mining in international areas are subject to this principle of the common heritage of humankind. And there hasn't been a similar decision for MCDR in international waters, but that's a discussion that should happen. And also on a more general note, I think this image that David also showed, I think it shows that the implications of considering MCDR at scale would really imply a very different ocean from what we have today, that would need to be managed in a very different way from the ocean governance frameworks that we have now. And that would also need to include a much broader equity discussion that is currently heard in most MCDR narratives. Thank you.